right now is a watershed moment, a kind of convergence of anxiety and desperation, and yet some paradoxical hope that the S&P and the White House will save us. And I want to look at that objectively as possible without just being negative. But I think in the larger perspective, we're seeing the worst global relations since 1949, probably the greatest financial bubble in the history of capital markets. I would think the highest geopolitical, military, and nuclear risk since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and probably the lowest trust in Western governance. Again, from the G7 to Jerusalem, from DC to Kiev, there's a distrust in leadership that's pretty palpable. We also, of course, have the greatest debt levels in the history of mankind. And as David Hume said in the 1750s, or von Mises centuries later said, debt destroys nations, it destroys peace, it destroys freedoms. And Ernest Hemingway said in the 1940s that when you see debt-soaked nations, you then see, the permanent ruin of currency debasement and war. These are certainly important things to consider right now. And I think also the jig is up on paper money, the inherent purchasing power of fiat money. I think electronic money, including stablecoins, another example of that fantasy empirically. And I don't think it's any different. So the world is moving to gold, I think, kind of a BS detector on these broken things. But I think in this backdrop of so much dysfunction, financial, political, currency, and debt, there's a lot of desperate policies kind of masquerading as evolutions, as energy, as kind of audacity. And it's certainly good to see energy compared to the last administration. These policies under Biden or certain policies under Trump, to me, weaponizing the world reserve currency, the whole stablecoin CBDC meme, the tariff policies, the External Revenue Service, even the BTF plan during the banking crisis under Biden, this fantasy that the Fed can control rates and money supply like a thermostat to keep the economy in order, the dysfunctions we're seeing in the comics and the stories we're being told about that, the idea that we should blame the BRICS for our own overspending in the US, even the conversation, of course, from Judy Shelton on gold-backed U.S. Treasuries and now from the Fed and the Treasury on gold revaluation. To me, these are desperate and not exciting signs, and I'll give reasons why. I think in this backdrop, I go back to the history, too, to put it into context. I mean, we have to, comfort our own assessments. You don't have to take my assessment or Lou Groman's assessment or Donald Trump's assessment, but I think, as John Kennedy said, there is something immoral about abandoning your own judgment. And to trust your own judgment, it has to be informed. Again, it doesn't have to be, overlap with mine, but informed judgment gives us some, I think, peace. And I think informed judgment is very hard, though, because it means you have to dig into some rabbit holes, some math, not hard math, and you have to look critically at even your own convictions and biases. And it's very hard in geopolitics and certainly in national politics to have an informed opinion with so much noise. But certainly in economics, it can be very hard to have an informed opinion. John Kenneth Galbraith, who was Kennedy's economic advisor, said that economics really aren't there to reveal truth, but to actually kind of disguise and evade truth. That was his final lesson from economics. And it reminds me of the complexity scheme or scam that I see in the markets from when I was a young idiot in the dot-com bubble to something a little bit more educated in markets through being a veteran. But there is so much intentional complexity, complex plumbing in the markets, whether it's central bank policy, whether it's derivatives and swaps and asset-backed security tranches and rating agencies, whether it's the COMEX and the FX exchanges, or certainly now as we get into the stablecoin or Genius Act oxymoron, there is intentional complexity. So it's very hard for the average man or woman on the street to really make an informed opinion on that. And I think that's, incumbent upon us. And I'll say that great economists, honest economists, whether it was Lord Mervyn King, who's still in the UK today, said economists are always looking to optimize. They're never looking at reality, that everything's optimizable. And as Richard Werner has made very clear in the last few years, these stochastic models that the Fed uses and the economists use to get tenure or to get popularity in the academic or think tank circles, none of their models have brought inflation to 2% in any of the developing economies over the last centuries. So it's breaking away from consensus think to contrarian think without just being nihilistic thinking. I think it's up to each of us. Again, it doesn't mean just taking my views. And I think the real goal for us and for every conversation is to set out the facts as we know them, draw our own conclusions. I will certainly have mine, but I think gold is calling BS on all of these systems, all of these solutions, all of these models, all of these kind of optimization nonsense, this be calm, carry on, as we're looking at the menu on the Titanic. And again, I said many times, deciding between between duck, fish, or steak, or red or white wine, when we really should be on the deck looking at the iceberg. And no one wants to see that because it's painful and it's unattractive. And I'm not just an iceberg looker. I'm not just looking for icebergs, but I've been bullish many times in my life, but in the bigger, larger section, you can't help but look at these paradoxes with a cynical eye. And I think a critical eye is really necessary right now, Michelle. I think you can't overstate debt enough. And once you understand just the basic concepts of these debt and the basic math, and it doesn't require a lot more facts, whatever strand you pull on, whether it's currencies, whether it's bond markets, even whether it's foreign policy, and certainly whether it's monetary policy, all of this in the bond market and the stock market, everything does come from the credit market, which is the debt market. So all of these things are connected. All this is verbunden. It's all connected. And I go back to these simple things. The day of my birth in the 70s, U.S. public debt, government debt, was $246 billion. And where I am today in my lifetime, we're now at $37 trillion. That's appalling. So these trillions matter. They're not just abstract numbers you throw out to show what you can memorize. And, global debt in 1997, when I started my first hedge fund, was at 30 trillion. And now it's at 300 trillion. That's a hockey puck. It's a rocket ship up and to the right in just the last 25 years. Household debt is now 97% debt to income. And so these are the numbers. And in case you think there's no evidence of how those things break things, you don't have to go back a century. You don't have to go back to FDR. You don't have to go back to 1929. Just in the last 6 to 7 years, it started, and I thought it was completely ignored by the mainstream media and the financial consensus RIA industrial complex. But the 2019 repo crisis was a disaster. It was a credit crisis. It was because of a debt crisis. And just a year later in March, during the COVID hysteria, that was also not a COVID-induced 2020 market plunge. That was a bond market-induced market plunge in 2020 because bonds and stocks fell together in 2020. And just 2 years later, across the pond in the UK, we had the gilt crisis. That was sovereign UK bonds being unloved, undesired, and yields spiking and the cost of debt skyrocketing. The next year in the US, we've already forgotten the headlines. You and I talked about it years back. We had that banking crisis in 2023. 4 of the 5 largest bank failures in US history forgotten. That was a credit crisis. It was a bond crisis. It was the US treasuries that were the underlying collateral on those banks. And then you fast forward to just this year, Liberation Day, the tariff, event, markets losing 10 trillion and then recovering when Trump did the two-step. But that wasn't a tariff crisis. That was a U.S. Treasury debt crisis, because right after Liberation Day, there were crickets at the U.S. Treasury auctions and massive sell-offs by U.S. owners of U.S. Treasuries, not just Japan and China. And again, it's not just me finding the evidence. The evidence is all around if you're willing to look for it. And in this debt crisis, we have very few options. We can default, which we won't do. So we'll have to inflate away our debt. And the way we do that is dishonest. Inflating away debt just means you have to have an inflation rate higher than your yield on your 10-year, and so you have negative real rates. That's the fancy term. You inflate away your debt. You debase your currency to do that. But the way we do that so dishonestly and disingenuously is we lie about the inflation rate. We just do. The BLS is a fiction source, not an honest math source. And the CPI scale used to measure that inflation scale has been, changed 22 times since 1980. It's probably closer to 10%. So we're running negative real rates. We're running a debased currency policy. We're running an invisible tax on the people, lower, middle, to upper class, to basically pay our debt by debasing the dollar, as von Mises, as David Hume, as even Ernest Hemingway, Warren, who weren't, all in the same generation. This is Immer wieder das Gleiche, are always the same. And this debt is so powerful that as we talk about stablecoins, or we talk about the markets, or we talk about tariffs, or any of these topics that are making current headlines, they're as old as history itself. We're in a desperate state because we're running out of options. And when you get to a debt to GDP level at World War II levels with no war, the emergency isn't war. The emergency is our own overspending and the mismanagement and criminal negligence of our monetary policymakers and our leadership, left or right, because all of these nations and all of these policies and all of these parties, whether it's Democrat or Republican, to me are just two stirrups to the same saddle. They spend more than they can to get short-term dopamine rush for political reasons, not for longer-term thinking. We have to look at tariffs from the positive and the negative. What you've just listed is a very compelling list of positive things, many of which I agree with. One of the reasons I was supportive of Trump was his larger plan of reshoring American labor, reshoring American jobs. Again, I'm from the Midwest. I've seen the Rust Belt. I've seen what offshoring the American dream to China with the World Trade Organization in 2001 under Clinton. That wasn't really China, becoming a bigger market for our blue jeans and things. It was China basically making our blue jeans and things. That was a misreported kind of new world And as I've said many times, the American dream is now made in China. So the idea of reshoring manufacturing, putting on tariffs in some strategic way to convince mostly American CEOs to bring labor back to America is absolutely something I agree with. The question is it going to work? Is it effective? Is the External Revenue Service incoming revenue offsetting the loss in GDP? How do we predict and make a prognosis on that? The most obvious bear case on this, or the negative case, is we've seen this for the last couple of months, people talking, of course, about Smoot-Hawley. That tariff act came at the top of a market bubble heading into a recession. It didn't end well for the Senate careers of Smoot and Hawley, and it really didn't end well for McKinley, the president who put those tariffs on, that it was an absolute disaster. Here in Europe, if you read the German press or the French press, or you listen to the economists here, they think this reshoring will take decades, years, whether it's pharma, aluminum, steel, whether it's wood, whether it's intermediary parts. That's their perspective. So even though if you're applauding the nobility of taking the first steps, it won't be solved in the near term for Trump, which maybe he's thinking long beyond his legacy, and that's fantastic. That again is, I think, to be determined. There's also the inflationary or deflationary debate about tariffs and which is better or worse in the short-term pain that Bessent and Trump talk about for long-term gain. Hypothetically, a 15% tariff pretty much means a 15% price hike. So it means inflation in certain goods. And as many economists will say, inflation creates its own deflation because as prices go up too high because of these protective tariffs, that creates its own deflation because demand falls, and so you get deflation. And then there's also the question of fairness. You know, the anti-Trump camp, and certainly in Europe, where I spend most of my time now, they think it's unfair. But I think it's important to remind European listeners as well that the value-added tax that Europe puts on American products is 20%. It really is in substance. And let's also not forget that China built its entire auto sector behind a 25% tariff wall, when Japan's tariffs were at 0 and the US was at 2.5% and the EU was at 10. So it's not like Trump is the only bully here playing, for national interest. All nations are self-interested, and all nations have used protective tariffs, or you could say weaponized tariffs in the past, to build their own demand inside their own borders. So you can take both sides of this. The real question, to your point, is will this be effective? And, a Yale professor was just on the other day talking about this. I've seen studies out of Zurich that are very convincing with their models that tariffs, will take at least a percentage point off our GDP near term, for the next few years, versus the revenues we're bringing in on the External Revenue Service on these tariff deals. We're going to lose growth because despite the long-term gain, the costs and the deficit spending and the production costs and the wage labor effects are going to be very expensive. That's going to hurt our growth. We really can't grow until we get out of debt. And we're trying to grow first without getting rid of that cannonball of debt. That's the key part. In Europe, people are wondering, and in Asia, how long will these executive orders last? How long will they be enforceable? Where is the Congress in this? And there is something either entertaining, horrific, or noble about this type of president who can do these type of executive actions, almost some like a monarch rather than a Democrat elected president. Again, that's for each of us to decide for ourselves. My view is, as I said from the very beginning, when you're at 120% debt to GDP, when you're at 37 trillion, when your deficit of spending versus tax receipts went from 1 million to now 2 million this year, these things are effective, the hundreds of billions, the 50 billions, but I hate to say it, and again, I'd say this to a Democrat or Republican, they're a guppy solution to a whale of a debt problem. And to me, going back to my original point, love it or hate it, I think these are desperate acts. It's certainly better than doing nothing, but we are at a point where, again, the Wizard of Oz isn't going to solve this. We're going to have to go through some austerity, some constructive destruction, some mean reversion in the markets, if we're really going to admit to ourselves, like we would in a family or a business, that we've spent more than we earn. We're going to have to tighten our belts. We're going to have austerity. We're going to have to cut spending. And where we're going to have to cut spending, the places where the debt to GDP would only be solved is in entitlements and military. And I don't see that happening. So this is where it really becomes a real paradox, regardless of where the S&P is or regardless of what the headlines are. That 37 trillion, that 120% debt to GDP, that bond market being unloved, and that de-dollarization that isn't a conspiracy theory, is all happening at the same time. That as the debt keeps rising, the bonds keep falling. We're in this desperate phase right now. Doesn't mean the end of the world. It doesn't mean the end of the dollar, but I don't see these as being long-term solutions right now.